Who would have thought that the act of throwing away a worn-out debit card would change the fate of an entire financial empire and reveal an $85 million secret? When Richard Coleman, an arrogant bank CEO, flicked Eleanor Brooks's old card onto the dirty floor, he thought he was just dismissing a confused, poor old woman. He laughed at her frayed coat and wooden cane. But he was wrong. Dead wrong. He didn't realize that the woman he just humiliated wasn't asking for charity. She was holding the power to destroy his career in a single heartbeat. To understand the gravity of the insult, you first have to understand the stage upon which it was delivered. First Heritage Bank wasn't designed to look like a place where you kept your checking account. It was designed to look like a cathedral where you worshipped the god of compound interest. The floors were Italian marble, polished to such a mirror sheen that you could see the stitching on your hemline as you walked. The air didn't smell like commerce. It smelled of cold air conditioning, expensive cologne, and the crisp, distinct scent of fresh currency. Above, a crystal chandelier the size of a small car hung suspended, casting a prism of light over the lobby that made everything sparkle. In the center of this golden arena stood Richard Coleman. At 50 years old, Richard was a man who had curated his existence to project absolute, unshakable power. He was wearing a bespoke navy suit cut in Milan, the kind that cost more than most people's cars, and on his wrist sat a Patek Philippe that ticked away seconds worth hundreds of dollars. He wasn't just standing there, he was holding court. Surrounding him were 3 potential investors from Dubai, men with pockets as deep as the ocean, and Richard was in the middle of his favorite speech, the exclusivity pitch. "We don't cater to the masses," Richard was saying, his voice a smooth baritone that carried easily across the quiet lobby. "We filter our clientele. We curate wealth. When you bank with First Heritage, you aren't just storing money, you are entering a private club where poverty isn't just discouraged, it is physically barred from entry." The investors nodded, impressed by the cruelty of his efficiency. They liked the idea of a sterile world where they never had to look at someone who needed help. Richard smiled, feeling the deal closing, feeling the adrenaline of his own importance. And then, the revolving doors at the entrance made a slow, grinding sound. The rhythm of the lobby broke. The investors turned their heads. Richard followed their gaze, expecting another titan of industry, perhaps a CEO or a hedge fund manager. Instead, what entered his palace of wealth was a ghost from a world he thought he had walled out. It was Eleanor. She didn't glide across the marble, she shuffled. Every step looked like a negotiation with gravity. She was wrapped in a gray wool coat that had seen at least 20 winters, the fabric pilling at the elbows and frayed at the hem. On her feet, she didn't wear Italian leather. She wore a pair of canvas sneakers that had been white a decade ago, now stained a permanent beige, with the rubber sole on the left foot peeling away slightly, revealing a hint of the sock underneath. She carried a plastic bag from a discount grocery store, and in her other hand she gripped a wooden cane that was polished smooth, not by a craftsman, but by years of her own palms sweating against the grain. The contrast was violent. Against the sharp lines and gleaming surfaces of the bank, Eleanor looked like a mistake. She looked like a smudge on a pristine lens. She had just spent 45 minutes on the number 42 bus, sitting next to a leaking window just to get here. Her joints ached from the damp cold outside, and her eyes, clouded with cataracts, squinted against the aggressive brilliance of the chandelier. Richard felt his stomach tighten. It wasn't pity, it was revulsion. He looked at his investors and saw the confusion on their faces. The spell he had woven, the illusion of an untouchable elite sanctuary, was being shattered by the mere presence of this old woman. She was a reminder of the reality Richard had spent millions to ignore. She was walking slowly toward the teller line, her cane making a dull thud, thud, thud sound that echoed in the silence, disrupting the hush of high finance. To Richard, she wasn't a human being with a history. She was a liability. She was visual pollution. He checked his watch, his heart rate spiking with irritation. He couldn't let this happen. He couldn't let a bag lady ruin the aesthetic of his pitch. He leaned in close to the head of security, a hulking man named Miller, who was standing by the pillar, looking equally uncomfortable. Richard's voice dropped to a hiss. low enough that the investors couldn't hear, but venomous enough to carry his intent perfectly. "Miller," Richard whispered, not taking his eyes off Eleanor's shuffling figure. "Why is the door policy being ignored?" Miller blinked, confused. "Sir? She's just an old lady. She walked through the detector." "I don't care if she walked through a wall," Richard snapped, a vein pulsing in his neck. "Look at her. Look at the shoes. Look at the bag. She's obviously confused. She's probably looking for a shelter or a bathroom. We are not a public utility, Miller. We are a private institution." He straightened his cuffs, fixing a smile on his face for the investors while his eyes remained cold and dead, locked on Eleanor. "Get her out," Richard commanded, his voice devoid of any empathy. "Intercept her before she reaches the counter. I don't want her begging from my clients. I don't want her asking for water. Just guide her to the exit and point her toward the subway. Do it now, before she touches anything. She looks like she's carrying lice." Richard turned back to his guests, his smile widening, trying to physically block their view of the elderly woman. But the damage was done. The air in the room had shifted. The tension was no longer about the deal. It was about the inevitable collision between the man who thought he owned the world and the woman he was about to try and erase from it. Miller, the security guard, hesitated. He was a big man, but he had a grandmother at home who looked a lot like Eleanor, and the idea of manhandling a 90-year-old woman simply for walking too slowly didn't sit right with his conscience. He took a tentative step toward her, his hand raised in a gentle, apologetic gesture, but he wasn't moving fast enough for Richard. Richard saw the hesitation. He saw the softness in Miller's eyes, and it disgusted him. This was exactly why the bank needed him, Richard told himself. The world was full of weak men who couldn't make the hard decisions, who couldn't protect the sanctity of the brand. He looked back at the investors. They were watching. This was a test. If he couldn't control his own lobby, how could he control their billions? "Excuse me, gentlemen," Richard said, buttoning his jacket with a sharp snap. "I have to handle a security breach personally." He didn't walk toward Eleanor, he marched. His strides were long and aggressive, the heels of his bespoke shoes clicking against the marble like gunfire. He cut through the lobby, intercepting Eleanor just as she reached the velvet rope that separated the common floor from the teller stations. He didn't just stop in front of her, he loomed. He used every inch of his height to create a wall of expensive fabric and hostility, blocking her path completely. Eleanor stopped. She didn't look up immediately. She took a breath, her chest rising and falling under the heavy wool coat. She could smell him before she saw him, the overpowering scent of musk and money. "Can I help you?" Richard asked. The words were polite, but the tone was a razor blade wrapped in silk. He crossed his arms, staring down at the top of her knit hat. Eleanor slowly lifted her head. Her eyes, framed by wrinkles that mapped a century of survival, met his. "I am just heading to the counter, young man," she said, her voice raspy but steady. "I need to check my balance." Richard laughed. It wasn't a warm laugh, it was a bark, loud enough for the investors to hear, loud enough to humiliate. He looked around the lobby, inviting the other patrons to share in the joke. "Check your balance?" Richard repeated, shaking his head with mock incredulity. "Madam, let me save you the walk. And let me save my tellers the wasted time." He took a step closer, invading her personal space, forcing her to lean back on her cane for stability. "There is a charity ATM at the gas station 3 blocks down," Richard said, pointing a manicured finger toward the exit. "That machine dispenses $10 bills. That is where you belong. You see, in this building we have overheads. We have standards. The transaction fee for a teller inquiry at First Heritage is $25. I am willing to bet that is more than your entire monthly welfare check." He leaned down, his face inches from hers, his voice dropping to a conspiratorial whisper that was somehow louder than a shout. "You are lost, Grandma. You are looking for a handout, and you wandered into a vault. We don't distribute soup here. We distribute dividends. Now, turn around, take your little bag of vegetables, and shuffle back to the bus stop before I have you arrested for loitering." The cruelty hung in the air, thick and suffocating. The lobby was silent. The investors were smirking. Miller was looking at his shoes, ashamed. But Eleanor didn't cry. She didn't beg. She slowly moved her hand to her pocket. Richard tensed, half expecting a weapon, but she simply pulled out a handkerchief. It was old, white cotton with a delicate hand-stitched floral border that had faded to gray. With agonizing slowness, she dabbed the sweat from her forehead. She folded the cloth with precision, treating the cheap fabric with more respect than Richard treated people. She looked at him. Really looked at him. She didn't see a CEO. She saw a scared little boy playing dress-up in his father's clothes. "You have a very loud suit, Mr. Coleman," Eleanor said softly. Richard blinked, thrown off balance. "Excuse me?" "And a very loud voice," she continued, tucking the handkerchief back into her pocket. She rested both hands on the head of her cane, anchoring herself against his aggression. "I have lived long enough to learn a simple truth about money, child. True wealth. It whispers. It doesn't need to prove itself. It sits quietly in the corner and watches." She gestured vaguely to the glittering lobby, to the showy chandelier, and finally to Richard himself. "But the poverty of the soul?" Eleanor shook her head sadly. "Oh, that screams. It screams because it is empty. It screams because it is afraid that if it stops making noise, everyone will see how small it really is." Richard's face flushed a deep, angry red. He opened his mouth to retort, to crush her with another insult, but Eleanor wasn't finished. "You are so loud," she whispered, her eyes narrowing slightly, piercing through his bravado. "You are loud and hollow, just like your grandfather was." Richard froze. The insult to his ego he could handle, but the reference to his family stopped him cold. He stared at her, trying to place her face, trying to understand how this relic from the bus stop knew about the legendary founder of the Coleman dynasty. But his arrogance was a blindfold. He couldn't see the connection. He couldn't see the history. All he saw was a senile old woman rambling. "My grandfather built this city," Richard spat, recovering his composure but losing his cool. "Do not speak his name with your mouth. You are delusional, you are senile, and you are trespassing." He turned his back on her, dismissing her existence entirely. "Miller!" Richard shouted, his voice cracking with rage. "Get her out! Now!" He didn't realize that by turning his back, he had just proved her point perfectly. He was screaming, and she was simply, quietly, standing her ground. 4. Part 4. Accusations of fraud and the echo of history. Most people, when faced with the shouting rage of a powerful man in a $3,000 suit, would shrink. They would apologize. They would retreat to the safety of the street. But Eleanor Brooks was not most people. She planted her feet firmly on the marble, her worn sneakers gripping the polished floor like tree roots digging into hard earth. She didn't move an inch. "I am a customer," Eleanor said. Her voice wasn't loud, but it cut through Richard's bluster like a diamond cutter. "And I am not leaving until a teller swipes my card." Richard stopped. The audacity of it stunned him. For a moment, his brain couldn't process the fact that this woman was defying him. Then, the shock turned into something darker. It turned into malice. He walked back to where the card still lay on the floor, the card she had refused to pick up. He snatched it up, not to return it, but to inspect it like a piece of evidence at a crime scene. He held it up to the light, squinting. Then, a look of triumphant disgust washed over his face. "Look at this," Richard announced, holding the plastic rectangle up for his investors and the gathering crowd to see. "Just look at it!" The card was dark blue, a design that First Heritage hadn't issued since the late 90s. The laminate was peeling at the corners. The magnetic strip was scratched almost white. "This design was discontinued 20 years ago," Richard barked, turning his glare back to Eleanor. "This isn't a debit card, it's a fossil!" He took a step closer, his voice dropping the pretense of customer service and shifting fully into the tone of a prosecutor. "Where did you get this?" he demanded. "Did you find it in a dumpster? Did you slide it out of a wallet you lifted on the bus? Or maybe," he sneered, looking her up and down, "maybe you rolled some poor senile veteran in a nursing home and took his keepsake." "It is my card," Eleanor said, her hands tightening on her cane. "Liar!" Richard shouted. "This card is dead. The system wouldn't even recognize it. You are trying to commit fraud in my lobby. You're trying to trick a teller into giving you access to a dormant account that doesn't belong to you." He snapped his fingers. "Miller! Security! Seal the exits!" The atmosphere in the bank shifted instantly from awkward to hostile. 3 uniformed guards, led by the reluctant Miller, moved in. They formed a semicircle around Eleanor, cutting her off from the door, cutting her off from the world. The investors watched with morbid curiosity. The other customers, women in pearls, men in trench coats, stepped back, clutching their purses and briefcases tighter, their eyes wide with the shared paranoia of the wealthy. They looked at Eleanor and they didn't see a grandmother. They saw a threat. "I want the police here now," Richard hissed at the head teller. "We have an attempted identity theft in progress." As the guards closed in, casting long shadows over her small frame, the sounds of the lobby began to blur for Eleanor. Richard's shouting voice distorted, stretching and warping until it sounded like a different voice, a voice from a lifetime ago. Suddenly, the marble floor wasn't marble anymore. It was hardwood, dark, polished mahogany. The smell of air conditioning and expensive cologne vanished, replaced by the scent of lemon furniture polish and old paper. It was 1955. Eleanor wasn't 90, she was 20. Her back was straight, her hair was thick and black, but she was wearing a uniform, a maid's uniform, a gray dress with a white apron that smelled of bleach. She was standing in the library of the Coleman Manor, the sprawling estate of Arthur Coleman Sr., Richard's grandfather. She was trembling then, just as she was trembling now. In her hand, she didn't hold a cane. She held a fountain pen. It was a beautiful thing, gold-nibbed, heavy, with black lacquer that felt warm to the touch. She hadn't stolen it. She had just picked it up from the desk while she was dusting. She had wanted to feel the weight of it. She had wanted to trace the letters of her name on a scrap of paper, just to practice what she was learning in night school. Then, the door had slammed open. Arthur Coleman Sr. had stormed in. He was a giant of a man, with the same cold blue eyes that Richard had now. He saw the pen in her hand. He didn't ask why she had it. He didn't ask if she was writing. "Thief!" he had roared. The word had hit her like a physical blow. I was just looking, sir," young Eleanor had stammered, dropping the pen on the desk as if it burned. "I was just practicing my letters." "Practicing?" Arthur had laughed, a cruel, sharp sound. "Don't lie to me, girl. Hands that scrub floors don't hold Mont Blanc pens. You were stealing it to pawn it. You wanted to buy some cheap trinket for your hair." "No, sir, please." "Get out," Arthur had commanded, pointing a shaking finger at the door. "Get your rags and get out of my house. If I ever see you on this property again, I'll have the sheriff drag you to the county jail. You people, you're all the same. Give you an inch and you steal the silver." She had been thrown out into the rain that night. No reference, no wages, just the shame burning in her chest. A shame that wasn't hers to carry but was forced upon her anyway. Flash. The memory receded, but the coldness remained. Eleanor blinked, returning to the present. The library was gone. The rain was gone. But the finger pointing at her was the same. The eyes were the same. The accusation was exactly the same. Richard Coleman was standing over her, waving the blue card like a weapon. "You people think you can just walk in here and take what isn't yours," Richard spat, echoing his grandfather almost word for word. "Well, not on my watch." The injustice of it rose in Eleanor's throat, tasting like bile. 70 years. 70 years had passed and the world had changed. Men had walked on the moon. The internet had connected the globe. But in this room, nothing had changed. The Coleman men still stood on their piles of gold, accusing the people who built their world of stealing the scraps. She looked at the guards surrounding her. She felt the heavy, suffocating weight of history pressing down on her shoulders. But this time, she wasn't 20 years old. She wasn't a maid, and she wasn't leaving. She gripped her cane tighter, her knuckles turning white. "Call the police," Eleanor said, her voice trembling not with fear, but with a suppressed volcanic rage. "Call them, because when they get here, Richard Coleman, they are going to need handcuffs. But they won't be for me." The golden elevator doors at the far end of the lobby slid open with a soft, melodious chime that seemed entirely out of place amidst the tension on the floor. Thomas Reynolds stepped out. If Richard Coleman was the face of First Heritage Bank, loud, flashy, and imposing, Thomas was its spine. At 45, he was the executive vice president, the man who actually read the contracts Richard signed without looking. He didn't wear Italian bespoke suits. He wore off-the-rack Brooks Brothers because he was too busy working to stand for fittings. He didn't have an entourage of investors. He carried a stack of files and a lukewarm coffee. Thomas adjusted his glasses, expecting the usual hum of commerce. Instead, he walked into a scene that looked more like a prison riot than a banking hall. He saw the ring of uniforms first. 3 security guards, their backs rigid, forming a human wall around something small in the center of the lobby. He saw the investors looking uncomfortable, checking their phones. And he heard Richard's voice, that unmistakable, grating boom of self-righteousness. "I don't care about your excuses," Richard was shouting, pointing into the center of the circle. "You are banned from these premises." Thomas frowned. He tucked his files under his arm and walked briskly across the marble floor. He didn't run. Men like Thomas didn't need to run to command attention. "Richard?" Thomas called out, his voice cutting through the noise. "What is going on here? Why is half the security detail in the lobby?" Richard spun around, seeing his second-in-command. He looked relieved, as if an ally had arrived to help him take out the trash. "Thomas, perfect timing," Richard said, wiping spit from the corner of his mouth. "We have a situation. Security breach. Some senile grifter managed to sneak past the front desk. She's trying to pass off a debit card from the Jurassic period. I was just about to have Miller drag her out before she infects the upholstery." Thomas stopped a few feet away. He looked at the wall of guards. Through the gap between Miller's shoulder and the next guard's hip, he caught a glimpse of the intruder. He saw the frayed gray coat. He saw the worn canvas sneakers. And he saw a hand, trembling slightly, gripping a handkerchief with a faded floral border. Thomas stopped breathing. The world seemed to tilt on its axis. That handkerchief. He hadn't seen it in 30 years, but he knew the pattern. He knew the way the stitching pulled at the corner. He remembered a younger version of that hand wiping tears from his own face when he was a scrawny, terrified sophomore who had just failed his algebra midterm. "Move," Thomas whispered. Richard blinked. "What?" "I said move!" Thomas roared. It was a sound nobody in the bank had ever heard from him, a primal, protective command that shattered the professional decorum instantly. Thomas dropped his files. Papers scattered across the floor, important contracts flying like confetti, but he didn't care. He shoved past Richard, physically pushing the CEO aside. He reached the wall of guards. Miller, seeing the look in the vice president's eyes, stepped back immediately. The other guards scrambled out of the way, revealing the small, defiant figure in the center. Eleanor stood there, clutching her cane, her chin held high, bracing herself for the police. She expected handcuffs. She expected another insult. Instead, she saw the man in the suit rushing toward her. "Wait!" Thomas yelled at a guard who had his hand on Eleanor's shoulder. Thomas didn't just speak, he swatted the guard's arm away with genuine anger. "Don't you dare touch her! Get your hands off her!" The lobby went deadly silent. Richard stood with his mouth open, watching his subordinate lose his mind. Thomas stopped right in front of Eleanor. He looked at her face, the wrinkles, the cataracts, the weary set of her jaw. He looked at the eyes that had once looked at him with infinite patience when he couldn't understand quadratic equations. Slowly, deliberately, Thomas Reynolds, the man who managed billion-dollar portfolios, dropped to one knee. He didn't care about his suit pants touching the dirty floor where the investors walked. He lowered himself until he was looking up at her, placing himself in a position of total submission. "Miss Brooks?" Thomas whispered, his voice cracking. Eleanor blinked, squinting down at him. The rage in her face softened into confusion. She tilted her head. "Tommy?" she rasped. "Tommy Reynolds?" "It's me, Miss Brooks," Thomas said, tears instantly pooling in his eyes. "It's Tommy, from homeroom 3B, Lincoln High, class of '98. He reached out, hesitating, as if she were a fragile relic, and gently took her hand. the hand Richard had called dirty. He held it in both of his own, pressing it to his forehead for a brief second of reverence. "My God," Thomas choked out. We all thought you had moved south. It's been so long." "I'm still here, Tommy," Eleanor said, a small, tired smile finally breaking through her armor. "Just a little older, a little slower." "What are you doing here?" Thomas asked, looking up at her with adoring eyes. "Why are they treating you like this?" "I just came to check my balance, Tommy," Eleanor said, looking over Thomas's shoulder at Richard. "But it seems your boss thinks I'm here to steal the silverware." Thomas stiffened. The warmth drained from his face, replaced by a cold, sharp realization. He slowly stood up, still holding Eleanor's hand to support her. He turned around. Richard was staring at them, his face a mask of confusion and disgust. "Thomas," Richard scoffed, trying to regain control of the narrative. "You know this person? Is she your nanny or something? Look, it's touching, really, but we have protocols. She is disturbing the peace." Thomas reached out and gently brushed a speck of dust from the shoulder of Eleanor's old coat. He straightened her collar. He treated her with the care one would give to a queen. Then he looked at Richard. His eyes were no longer the eyes of a subordinate. They were the eyes of a man who had just seen something unforgivable. "My nanny?" Thomas repeated, his voice dangerously low. "Richard, you idiot!" He stepped aside, presenting Eleanor to the room not as a beggar but as a monument. "This is Eleanor Brooks," Thomas announced, his voice ringing off the marble walls. "She isn't a beggar. She is the reason I can read a balance sheet. She is the reason half the people in this city can count their own money." He looked at the security guards who were now shuffling their feet in shame. "She was the toughest, most brilliant mathematics teacher Lincoln High ever saw," Thomas said, his voice trembling with emotion. "When my father died and I couldn't afford lunch, this woman split her sandwich with me every single day for 2 years. When I couldn't afford a calculator for the SATs, she gave me hers." Thomas turned his glare back to Richard. "She taught me that numbers don't lie," Thomas said, stepping closer to his boss. "But she also taught me that people do. And Richard, you just made the biggest miscalculation of your life." Richard rolled his eyes, checking his Patek Philippe again. "Okay, fine. She was a teacher. Bravo. Thank you for your service, Miss Brooks. Now we have that cleared up." He gestured dismissively at the counter. "Thomas, if she's your friend, take her to the break room and give her a coffee. But get her off the floor. The investors are waiting, and I'm sure her account balance, whatever is left of her teacher's pension, isn't worth halting a merger meeting for." Richard smirked, thinking he had been generous. "She probably has, what, $500? Maybe 1,000 if she was frugal? Just give her some cash from petty cash and send her home." Thomas looked at Richard. He looked at the smirk. And for the first time in his career, he wanted to punch the man signing his paychecks. "You think so?" Thomas asked softly. "You think she's here for petty cash?" "I think she's wasting my time," Richard snapped. "Then let's check," Thomas said. "Let's check right now." He didn't ask a teller. He didn't ask for permission. Thomas grabbed Eleanor's arm gently. "Come with me, Miss Brooks," Thomas said, leading her not to the break room but toward the VIP desk, Richard's personal station. "Let's see exactly how much you're worth." Richard laughed, shaking his head. "This is going to be embarrassing, Thomas. Don't say I didn't warn you." But as Thomas guided Eleanor past the velvet rope, passing the stunned investors, nobody was laughing. The air in the room had grown heavy with the static electricity of a storm that was about to break. And Richard Coleman was standing right in the center of the strike zone, holding a metal rod, completely unaware of the lightning bolt heading his way. Thomas didn't take Eleanor to the break room. He guided her to the plush leather chair usually reserved for high-net-worth clients waiting for loan approvals, the chair Richard had been sitting in just moments ago. He helped her sit, arranging her cane against the mahogany desk, ignoring Richard's frantic hand signals to get her out of sight. Then, Thomas turned around. He took off his glasses and wiped them with his tie, a nervous tic that surfaced only when he was fighting to keep his composure. When he put them back on, his eyes swept the room. He looked at Miller, the security guard who was staring at his own boots in shame. He looked at the investors, who were shifting uncomfortably, realizing they were witnessing something far more personal than a business transaction. And finally, he locked eyes with Richard. "Do you know what the starting salary for a public school teacher was in 1995, Richard?" Thomas asked. His voice wasn't loud, but it had a tremor in it, the vibration of a bridge under too much weight. Richard sighed, checking his watch again. "Thomas, please. I don't have time for a history lesson. The Nikkei market opens in 20 minutes. "It was $22,000 a year, Thomas continued, ignoring him. He took a step toward the center of the lobby, addressing the entire room now. $22,000 to shape the minds of 30 children who didn't want to be there. He pointed a shaking finger at Eleanor, who sat quietly, watching him with the same pride she used to have when he solved a problem on the chalkboard. "You look at this woman and you see a nuisance," Thomas said, his voice rising. "You see someone who doesn't belong in your cathedral of wealth. But let me tell you what I see." He walked over to Miller, the large security guard. "Miller, you have a daughter in middle school, right?" "Yes, sir," Miller mumbled. "Imagine she goes to school with holes in her sneakers because her dad got laid off," Thomas said, the memory raw in his voice. "Imagine she sits in the cafeteria every day with an empty tray, pretending she isn't hungry because she's too proud to ask for help. That was me, Richard. That was me in 1998. Thomas turned back to Eleanor. "Ms. Brooks noticed. She didn't call child services. She didn't embarrass me in front of the class. She just started bringing an extra sandwich every day. Turkey and cheese, an apple, a carton of milk." Thomas's voice broke. "She told me she accidentally made too much. She did that for 3 years, on a salary of $22,000. The lobby was deadly quiet. Even the investors from Dubai were listening now, captivated by the raw humanity of the moment. "She stayed late to tutor me in calculus when I couldn't afford a prep course," Thomas continued, tears streaming freely down his face now. "She paid for my college application fees out of her own pocket. I am standing here, wearing this suit, managing your billions, because this woman invested in me when I was worth absolutely zero." He turned on Richard, his anger flaring hot and bright. "And you want to throw her out? You want to arrest her? For what? For not looking like a hedge fund manager? Richard, she has more value in her little finger than everyone in this room combined." For a moment it seemed like the speech had landed. The air in the room felt heavy with the weight of Thomas's gratitude. Then, a slow clapping sound broke the spell. Clap, clap, clap. It was Richard. He was smiling. It was a patronizing, tight-lipped smile that didn't reach his eyes. He shook his head, looking at Thomas with the pity one might show a naive child. "Beautiful," Richard said, stopping his applause. "Truly, that was moving, Thomas. I mean it. It sounds like the script for a very heartwarming after-school special." Richard walked over to Thomas and placed a hand on his shoulder. It looked like a gesture of comfort, but his grip was hard, possessive. "But here in the real world," Richard whispered, his voice dropping to a harsh hiss, "sentimental value doesn't buy equity. We run a bank, Thomas, not a charity, not a church. We deal in liquidity. We deal in assets." He let go of Thomas and turned to look at Eleanor with cold, calculating eyes. "I respect that she bought you a sandwich, Thomas, I really do. That was very nice of her," Richard sneered. "But let's be realistic. She was a teacher. She retired decades ago. What does she have in that account? A pension? Social Security checks?" Richard chuckled, looking at the investors to ensure they were following his logic. "Let's do the math. A teacher's salary, living expenses, inflation. I'm guessing she has what? $50,000? Maybe $100,000 if she lived like a monk." He spread his hands wide. "Thomas, listen to me. I have clients waiting who move $50,000 in a rounding error. You are holding up a merger worth 9 figures to protect a woman whose entire net worth couldn't buy the tires on my car." Richard leaned in close to Thomas's face. "Don't let your personal feelings cloud your professional judgment. You are the vice president. Act like it. Process her little withdrawal, give her a free calendar, and get her out of my VIP section. She is bad for business." Richard straightened his tie, feeling he had won the argument with the unassailable logic of capitalism. He believed that money was the only scorecard that mattered. Thomas stared at his boss. The sadness in his eyes vanished, replaced by a cold, hard resolve. He realized then that Richard was broken. There was a piece missing in his soul that no amount of money could fill. "Bad for business," Thomas repeated quietly. "Terrible for business," Richard confirmed. "Poverty scares the money away." "Okay," Thomas said. "You want to talk about business? Let's talk about business." He turned away from Richard and walked over to the computer terminal at the VIP desk. He sat down. He didn't look like the emotional student anymore. He looked like the shark who handled the bank's most complex portfolios. "Ms. Brooks," Thomas said, his voice steady and professional. "Do you have your card?" "I do, Tommy," Eleanor said, "but he threw it on the floor." Thomas didn't ask Richard to pick it up. He wouldn't give him the dignity. He typed in his own override code, the master key that bypassed the need for a card swipe. "Name, Eleanor Brooks," Thomas said as he typed. "DOB, August 14th, 1934. Richard scoffed from behind him. "Go ahead, Thomas. Pull it up. Show us the 3 digits. Let's see if she can afford the bus fare home." The computer whirred. The screen flickered as it accessed the deep archives of the bank's database. Because Eleanor's account wasn't a standard checking account. It was something else, something older. Thomas watched the screen load. He expected to see a modest savings account. He expected to see Richard proven right about the number, if not the principal. Then, the profile loaded. Thomas stopped breathing. His hand froze over the mouse. He blinked. He leaned forward, squinting at the screen, sure that there was a glitch, sure that the decimal point was in the wrong place. "What's wrong?" Richard called out, seeing Thomas freeze. "System can't find it? Did she forget she closed the account in 1990? Thomas didn't answer. He couldn't speak. He just stared at the number. The number was so long it had wrapped to a second line. "Richard," Thomas whispered. His voice was unrecognizable. "What?" Richard snapped, impatient. Thomas slowly swiveled the monitor around. The screen glowed bright green in the dimly lit lobby. "You need to see this," Thomas said. "You really need to see this." Richard sighed loudly, rolling his eyes as he marched over to the desk. "Fine, what is it? Did she overdraft? Does she owe us money?" Richard looked at the screen. The smirk slid off his face like sludge. His eyes widened until the whites showed all around. His jaw actually dropped, hanging loose and slack. The room went silent. The only sound was the hum of the computer fan, cooling the processor that was displaying a number that defied all of Richard's prejudices. Thomas sat at the terminal, his fingers hovering over the keyboard. This wasn't the standard teller interface. He had engaged the executive override protocol, a black screen with simple white text reserved for auditing the bank's most sensitive accounts. Richard stood behind him, arms crossed, tapping his foot. "Come on, Thomas. The investors are getting bored. Print out her balance. What is it, 3 digits? 4? And let's get back to actual business." "I can't just print it," Thomas muttered, his brow furrowed. "The system is lagging. It's pulling data from the deep archives. This account hasn't been accessed physically since 1982. 1982, Richard laughed, turning to the investors. "You hear that? She probably has a savings bond worth $50 and a free toaster waiting for her." Eleanor sat perfectly still in the leather chair. She didn't look at the screen. She looked at her hands, the hands that had scrubbed floors, graded papers, and held the chalk that taught a generation. She knew what was on that screen. She didn't need a computer to tell her the value of patience. Beep. The terminal flashed. Thomas leaned in. "Okay, let's see the liquid assets." He hit enter. The screen refreshed. A number appeared. Thomas blinked. He took off his glasses, wiped them on his tie again, and put them back on. He squinted. "That's a glitch," Thomas whispered. "What?" Richard stepped closer, annoyed. "What's a glitch? Does it say 0? Is she overdrawn?" "No," Thomas said, his voice sounding hollow. "It's not 0. Thomas stared at the comma placement. He counted the digits. 1, 2, 3, 6, 7, 8. He felt the blood drain from his face. His heart hammered against his ribs like a trapped bird. He turned around slowly in the swivel chair. He looked at Richard, and for the first time there was no anger in his eyes. There was only fear. The fear of a man watching someone walk off a cliff. "Richard," Thomas said softly, "you need to look at this." "I don't have time to—" "Look at it!" Thomas screamed, slamming his hand on the desk. Richard flinched. The investors jumped. The silence in the lobby shattered. Richard marched to the screen, furious. "Fine! Let's see what the big mystery is." He looked at the monitor. Richard stared. He blinked. He shook his head, looking for the decimal point. He thought maybe it was $85,000. That would be high for a teacher, but possible. But the commas were relentless. 85,421,000. "This," Richard stammered, his arrogance evaporating instantly. "This is a system error. It has to be. A hacker? Did she hack us?" He looked at Eleanor. She was just an old woman in a frayed coat. Thomas began to scroll down the screen. His hands were shaking as he read the transaction history. "It's not a hack, Richard," Thomas whispered, reading the data aloud. "Look at the portfolio. Initial deposit, $500. Date, June 1955. He scrolled. Purchase, 100 shares of IBM. Purchase, 500 shares of Coca-Cola. Purchase, Berkshire Hathaway, Class A, bought in 1965. Thomas stopped scrolling and looked up, his eyes wide with awe. "She didn't just save her pension, Richard. She invested. Every single paycheck, every summer job. She bought into the American economy before it exploded. She held it through the crash of '87. She held it through the dot-com bubble. She let it compound." Thomas turned to the Client Notes tab. There was a red flag next to the account name. Thomas gasped. The air left his lungs. "Oh my God," Thomas choked out. "What?" Richard demanded, sweat beading on his forehead. "What trust?" "You idiot," Thomas said, looking at his boss with a mixture of pity and horror. "You don't know? The Eleanor Trust? The scholarship fund? The one that pays for 50 underprivileged kids to go to college every year? The one that is literally our bank's largest philanthropic client?" Thomas pointed a trembling finger at the old woman in the chair. "That's her, Richard. That's Eleanor. She is the trust. She is the biggest client we have." Richard felt the room spin. The marble floor seemed to tilt. The chandelier above him suddenly felt like a guillotine blade waiting to drop. He looked at Eleanor. He really looked at her. He saw the frayed coat. He saw the worn sneakers. He saw the cheap plastic bag. And then he saw the $85 million standing behind her. "Miss Brooks?" Richard whispered. His voice was no longer a boom. It was a squeak. Eleanor slowly stood up. She picked up her cane. She picked up her plastic bag. She didn't look at the screen. She looked at Richard. "Is the machine working now, Mr. Coleman?" she asked pleasantly. "Or should I still go to the gas station?" Richard opened his mouth, but no sound came out. He was a man drowning in dry land. The investors behind him were whispering frantically. One of them, the lead investor from Dubai, stepped forward. "Mr. Coleman," the investor said, his voice cold, "did you just try to evict an $85 million client because she wasn't dressed well?" Richard turned to them, his hands shaking. "Gentlemen, please, it was a misunderstanding, a security protocol." "It wasn't a misunderstanding," Thomas cut in, standing next to Eleanor like a bodyguard. "It was a choice." Thomas looked at the screen one last time, then hit the print button. The sound of the receipt printing was loud and rhythmic. Zzzt, zzzt. He tore off the slip. It wasn't a receipt. It was a death sentence for Richard's career. Thomas handed the slip to Eleanor. "Your balance, Miss Brooks," Thomas said, bowing his head. Eleanor took the slip. She didn't read it. She folded it carefully and put it in her pocket, right next to the old handkerchief. "Thank you, Tommy," she said. Then she turned to Richard. "Now," Eleanor said, her voice hardening into steel, "I would like to make a transaction." Richard Coleman didn't just pale. He looked as though his soul had been physically vacuumed out of his body. The blood drained from his face so fast it left him a sickly, waxen gray. His legs, which had carried him with such swagger only minutes ago, turned to water. He collapsed backward, missing his own executive chair and sliding ungracefully against the mahogany desk, catching himself just before hitting the floor. He stared at Eleanor. Then he stared at the screen. Then back at Eleanor. His brain, wired entirely for surface-level aesthetics, was misfiring. It couldn't reconcile the data. "But," Richard stammered, his voice trembling like a child's, "but you took the bus. I saw you get off the number 42. You're wearing canvas shoes. You have a plastic bag." He pointed a shaking finger at her worn-out coat. "Rich people don't look like you," Richard whispered, the words tumbling out in a frantic, confused stream. "They wear Rolexes. They drive Bentleys. They don't count coupons." Eleanor watched him crumble. She didn't gloat. She didn't smile. She simply took a step forward, the thud of her cane sounding heavy and final in the silent lobby. She looked down at him with an expression of profound pity. "You poor, hollow boy," Eleanor said softly. She leaned forward, resting her weight on her cane. "I take the bus, Richard, because a round trip costs me $5. A driver would cost me $50,000 a year." She gestured to the screen, to the $85 million glowing in green. "Do you know how many textbooks $50,000 buys?" Eleanor asked. "Do you know how many hungry students that feeds?" "I don't wear my wealth on my wrist, Richard. I wear it in the schools I've built. I wear it in the libraries I've funded. I wear it in the future I am building for children who started with nothing, just like I did." She looked at his Patek Philippe watch. "You spent $50,000 on a watch to tell you the time. I spent $50,000 to give a student the time to learn. That is the difference between us. You buy things. I build people." Richard opened his mouth to speak, to apologize, to beg, but he had no words left. The logic of his life had just been dismantled. Eleanor turned her back on him. She looked at Thomas. "Thomas," she said, her voice shifting from pity to business, "what is the daily transfer limit for a level 5 trust account?" Thomas stood straighter. He knew what was coming. "There is no limit, Ms. Brooks. You have unrestricted liquidity." "Good," Eleanor said. She pointed a gnarly finger toward the large glass windows at the front of the lobby. Across the street, the blue logo of Sovereign Bank, First Heritage's fiercest competitor, shone in the afternoon sun. "I want you to initiate a wire transfer," Eleanor commanded. "The full amount, $85,421,000, plus the 42 cents. "Ms. Brooks, wait!" Richard scrambled to his feet, panic giving him a sudden surge of adrenaline. "You can't do that! You can't just move $85 million! It takes days! The paperwork!" "I want it moved to Sovereign Bank," Eleanor continued, ignoring him completely. "Right now! Today!" "Please!" Richard begged, grabbing the edge of the desk. "Ms. Brooks, be reasonable. If you pull that capital, our liquidity ratio drops below the federal requirement. You'll trigger a reserve audit. You'll crash this branch." Eleanor turned her head slowly. Her eyes were cold steel. "I cannot leave my life's work in a vault guarded by a man who is blind," Eleanor said. "You judged me by my cover, Richard. Now I am judging you by your character, and I find you bankrupt." She nodded to Thomas. "Execute the transfer, Tommy." Thomas didn't hesitate. He sat at the terminal. He didn't look at his boss. He looked at the screen. "Thomas, don't you dare!" Richard screamed, lunging for the keyboard. Miller, the security guard, stepped in. He put a massive hand on Richard's chest, holding him back effortlessly. "Let him work, sir," Miller said, his voice deep and satisfying. Thomas hit enter. The silence that followed was deafening, but it was broken a second later by a sound that made Richard's blood freeze. It was the sound of a notification, then another. Ping, ping, ping. It wasn't just Richard's phone, it was Thomas's phone. It was the investors' phones, the red alert from the central server. Richard's phone vibrated violently on the desk. He looked down. The screen lit up with a message from Board of Directors, Emergency. The lead investor from Dubai, who had been watching the entire scene in silence, looked at his own phone, then at Richard. He buttoned his suit jacket. "Mr. Coleman," the investor said coldly, "it seems your bank has just lost its primary liquidity anchor. And you have lost our confidence." The three investors turned and walked toward the exit without shaking hands. They stepped around Eleanor respectfully as they left. Richard snatched up his phone. He read the message. It wasn't an inquiry, it was a verdict. "Richard, system alerts indicate a catastrophic client exit at your branch. We have also received a direct complaint regarding code of conduct violations witnessed by key investors. Effective immediately, you are suspended pending an internal investigation. Hand over your badge and keys to Vice President Reynolds." Richard dropped the phone. It hit the marble floor with a crack. He looked up. Thomas was standing there holding his hand out. "The badge, Richard," Thomas said quietly, "and the keys." Richard looked around his cathedral. The chandelier seemed dimmer. The marble seemed colder. He was the king of nothing. Trembling, Richard reached into his pocket. He pulled out his key card. He unclipped his ID badge. He dropped them into Thomas's hand. I'm a Coleman," Richard whispered, his eyes unfocused. "My grandfather built this place." "And you just emptied it," Thomas replied. Thomas turned to Miller. "Please escort Mr. Coleman to the exit. He is no longer an employee of First Heritage." Miller nodded. He took Richard's arm, not gently. "Let's go, sir. Don't make a scene." As Richard was led away, shuffling like a prisoner, he passed Eleanor one last time. She didn't look at him. She was busy checking her vegetable bag to make sure her carrots hadn't been crushed. She had already moved on. He was just a bad investment she had finally liquidated. The revolving door of First Heritage Bank made a low, grinding sound. The same sound that had heralded Eleanor's arrival only 20 minutes ago. But this time, it wasn't admitting a ghost. It was expelling a king. Richard Coleman walked through the glass panes, not with the stride of a titan, but with the shuffle of a broken man. In his hands, he didn't hold a merger contract or a glass of champagne. He clutched a hastily packed cardboard box containing a stapler, a framed photo of himself, and the Patek Philippe watch he had taken off his wrist because it suddenly felt too heavy to wear. Security guard Miller walked a step behind him, ensuring the former CEO crossed the property line. There was no roughness, no shouting, just the crushing, silent weight of professional protocol. Richard stepped onto the sidewalk, the cold wind hitting his face. He looked back at the golden palace his grandfather had built. Through the glass, he could see the lobby. He saw the tellers returning to work. He saw the investors chatting with Thomas. And he saw Eleanor, still sitting in his chair, looking like she had belonged there all along. Richard realized then that he hadn't built a legacy. He had just been renting the space. He turned his collar up against the wind and walked toward the subway station, invisible to the city he thought he owned. Inside the bank, the atmosphere had transformed. The tension had evaporated, replaced by a sense of awe and nervous energy. Thomas Reynolds stood by the VIP desk. The screen still showed the pending transfer of $85 million to Sovereign Bank. The progress bar was at 99%. "The transfer is ready to finalize, Ms. Brooks," Thomas said, his voice heavy with regret. I just want to say before you go that I am sorry. I failed you today. I should have stepped in sooner." Eleanor watched him. She saw the boy who used to share her sandwich. She saw the man who had risked his career to kneel before her. "Cancel it, Tommy," Eleanor said softly. Thomas froze. He looked at her. "What?" "Cancel the transfer," Eleanor repeated. She reached into her plastic grocery bag and pulled out a small, bruised apple. She placed it on the mahogany desk, a stark contrast to the leather and gold. "I don't want to move my money," Eleanor said, smoothing her coat. "Sovereign Bank has very uncomfortable chairs, and their coffee is terrible." Thomas let out a breath he felt like he had been holding for 20 years. "But Richard said—" "Richard is gone," Eleanor interrupted. "The weed has been pulled. Now the garden can grow." She looked at the staff gathering around, the tellers, the junior managers, the people who had been too afraid to speak up. "But I have conditions, Thomas. If my money stays, the culture changes." "Anything," Thomas said immediately. "Name it." "This lobby," Eleanor said, gesturing with her cane. "It's too cold. It scares people. I want you to open these doors on Saturday mornings." "For business?" Thomas asked, confused. "For education," Eleanor corrected. "I want a free financial literacy program for the people who take the bus, for the people who clean your floors, for the single mothers who don't know how to open a savings account." She looked Thomas dead in the eye. "You teach them what I taught you. You teach them about compound interest. You teach them that money is a tool, not a master. And you treat every single one of them like they have $85 million in their pocket. Do we have a deal?" Thomas looked at the apple on his desk. He smiled, a genuine warm smile that reached his eyes. "We have a deal, Miss Brooks," Thomas said. "I'll teach the first class myself." Eleanor nodded, satisfied. She picked up her bag. She picked up her cane. The transaction was complete. She hadn't just saved her dignity, she had planted a seed for the next generation. Thomas walked her to the door. As they reached the exit, the afternoon sun was streaming in, bathing the marble in a warm, golden light that felt real, not artificial like the chandelier. Eleanor stopped. She turned to Thomas and took his hand. Her grip was frail, but her spirit was iron. "Remember this feeling, Tommy," she whispered. She looked at the busy street outside, at the rush of people, rich, poor, young, old, all mixing together in the chaotic dance of the city. "Never judge a book by its cover," Eleanor said, her voice trembling slightly with emotion. "The pages are where the story is. That boy in the hoodie? He might be the next inventor. That woman in the cleaning uniform? She might be raising a surgeon." She squeezed his hand. "And the old lady sitting on the bus?" Eleanor winked, a spark of youthful mischief in her eyes. "She might be the one signing your paycheck tomorrow." Thomas nodded, swallowing the lump in his throat. "I won't forget. I promise." Eleanor released his hand. She pushed open the heavy glass door and stepped out onto the sidewalk. She didn't get into a limousine. She didn't call a driver. She walked slowly toward the bus stop, her gray coat blending into the crowd. Thomas stood in the doorway watching her go until she was just a speck in the distance. He wasn't watching a customer leave. He was watching a giant walk among mortals. Behind him, the bank was buzzing. Tellers were smiling. Miller was helping a young man in construction clothes fill out a deposit slip. The fear was gone. Thomas turned back to his lobby. He walked over to the desk, picked up the bruised apple Eleanor had left, and placed it right next to his nameplate. It was the most valuable asset in the entire building. Camera pans up from the apple to the new sign on the bank door. First Heritage, Community Learning Center, Saturdays, open to all. Richard Coleman lost his empire because he only counted dollars, but Eleanor Brooks won the world because she counted people. True wealth isn't what you have in the bank, it's what you leave in the hearts of others. Be kind. You never know who you are talking to.